Rose Calloway's sleeve caught on the doorframe when she stumbled off the stagecoach, and the fabric pulled back just far enough. Just far enough for the man standing below to see what she'd spent 4 years learning to hide. The bruise wrapped her wrist like a brand. 4 fingers on one side, a thumb on the other. The signature of a hand that had held on long past the point of asking. The cowboy went absolutely still. His eyes came up to hers. And in that single, suspended second, Rose saw that he understood exactly what he was looking at. She yanked her arm back. Too late. If this story already has your heart, hit that like button right now and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far Rose's story travels. Subscribe and stay with me, because what this man does next will surprise you. Rose Calloway did not cry when she stepped off the stagecoach in Abilene, Kansas. She hadn't cried in 2 years. She'd trained herself out of it the way you train yourself out of flinching at loud sounds, by enduring enough of them that your body eventually stops believing the warning matters. The door swung open. Light flooded in. She reached for the frame, found it, and put her boot on the step. Her heel caught her hem. The step disappeared, and the whole world tilted sideways in the space of half a second. She threw her hands out instinctively. Old reflex, useless reflex. The reflex of a woman who had learned that throwing your hands out when you fell only gave someone something to grab. And the fabric of her sleeve snagged and pulled back to the elbow, just as 2 hands caught her arms and stopped her fall cold. "I've got you." Low voice, steady, no alarm in it. Rose's body did what 4 years had trained it to do. It went rigid. It pulled back. It prepared for what came next. What came next was nothing. The hands released her immediately, not dropped her, released her. The deliberate and careful release of someone who understood the difference. And she was standing on her own 2 feet in the Abilene dust, with her heart hammering loud enough to hear. She looked up. He was tall, dark-haired, with silver coming in at the temples, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 2 or 3 days. His eyes were gray, and they were looking directly at her wrist, at what her wrist was showing. Rose snatched her arm back. She pulled the sleeve down and pressed it flat, and took 1 step backward and put her carpet bag between them without thinking. Her fingers found the button at her cuff and worked it closed. The man said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, "Miss Calloway." "Yes," she said. Her voice came out even. She'd learned to keep her voice even. "Daniel Holt." He didn't reach out a hand for her to shake. He just said his name and let it land where it landed. "There's a hotel a block down. I've arranged a room." He bent and picked up her trunk from the ground without asking permission or making a performance of it. "When you're ready," he started walking. Rose stood still for 1 moment. She looked at the back of his shoulders, at the unhurried set of them, at the way he carried her trunk, the same way he'd probably carry a sack of feed, like a thing that needed moving from one place to another, and complaining about it would be a waste of breath. Then she followed him. The street was wide and rutted and full of people who had absolutely nothing better to do than watch a mail-order bride arrive. Rose felt every single set of eyes. "That her?" A man outside the saloon, leaning back in his chair with the boneless ease of someone for whom judgment cost nothing. Young, maybe 20. "Holt finally got his woman delivered." Laughter from the doorway behind him. "Little rough around the edges," someone else said. "Reckon she'll last the winter?" More laughter. Rose kept her eyes on Daniel Holt's back. She kept her chin level. She kept walking. Daniel stopped. He didn't spin around. He didn't raise his voice. He just stopped walking and turned, slow and complete, the way a weather vane turns when the wind makes up its mind. And he looked at the young man in the chair. "Billy Marsh," he said. Billy Marsh's grin went uncertain at the edges. "Just talking, Holt." "I know what you were doing." Daniel's voice was the same quiet it had been since the moment he'd caught her. It hadn't changed at all. That was the thing Rose kept noticing. It didn't change. "Find somewhere else to do it." Billy opened his mouth. "That wasn't a discussion," Daniel said. Billy closed his mouth, looked away, found something interesting to study on the far end of the street. Daniel turned back around and started walking again. Rose followed him and said nothing. She was doing arithmetic. She was always doing arithmetic about men, running the numbers, checking the sums, waiting for the calculation to come out wrong, the way it always eventually came out wrong. A man who defended you in public could still be a different man in private. A man who was quiet and controlled outside could be loud and uncontrolled behind a closed door. She knew this. She had learned this at considerable cost. But she was watching his hands. His hands were loose at his sides. No tension in them. No performance. No white-knuckled satisfaction at having put someone in their place. He had simply found the behavior unacceptable and said so. And now he was done with it. Already done with it. Already 3 steps past it. Already somewhere else in his head. She filed that away. Evidence. Not enough, but a start. The hotel was run by a woman named Nora Price, who had iron-gray hair and eyes that had clearly been arriving at conclusions about people for at least 50 years. She looked at Rose the way a doctor looks at a patient. Not unkindly, but without pretense. "Rose Calloway," Nora said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Room's ready." Nora set a key on the counter and left her hand on it for just a half-second before sliding it across. A pause so brief, Rose almost missed it. "Third door on the right, top of the stairs." Daniel set the trunk down at the foot of the staircase. "I'll take that up." "I can manage," Rose said immediately. "Trunk weighs 60 pounds. I carried it onto the stagecoach in Nashville." "Then you've done enough carrying." He picked it up. No argument, no negotiation, no look that said she was being difficult. He just picked it up and started up the stairs. Rose followed him up to the third door on the right. He set the trunk down, stepped back out into the hallway and said, "I had a lock put on." Rose looked at the door. There was a new bolt on it, iron, recently installed. She could see where the wood was still pale and fresh around the screws. She looked at Daniel. "Lock that works from the inside," he said. "You've got the only key." He reached into his coat pocket and held out a second key. "That's the spare. You keep it." Rose took it. She turned it over in her fingers. Small, ordinary. The kind of key that opened nothing important in the world outside this door. "Why?" she said. Daniel leaned against the hallway wall with his arms crossed, not crowding the doorway, not blocking her path, maintaining the particular careful distance she had noticed since the moment they'd met. Always just far enough. "Because a woman who's been brought out here by a man she doesn't know ought to be able to lock her door at night. That's why. Most men wouldn't think of that. I reckon most men aren't trying to convince someone to trust them." Rose looked at him. "Is that what you're trying to do?" "That's what I'd like to do," he said. "Over time, if you're willing." He pushed off the wall and straightened up. "You've had a long few days. Rest. There's a dining room downstairs. Supper's at 6. Come down if you want. Have a tray sent up if you don't." He paused. "You don't owe me supper conversation, Miss Calloway. You don't owe me anything tonight." He turned to go. "Mr. Holt." He stopped. Rose's fingers closed around the key. She had questions she needed answered, and she'd learned from hard experience that it was better to ask them before you were somewhere you couldn't leave, rather than after. "I want to know something." All right. The advertisement said, "Practical partnership." Those were your exact words. She watched his face. What does that mean to you? Daniel was quiet for a moment, just long enough that she knew he was actually thinking about it, not reaching for the first answer that sounded good. It means two people working the same ground, in the same direction, he said. It means fair treatment and honest dealings, and somebody to talk to at the end of the day. He met her eyes. It means nothing happens in this arrangement that you don't choose yourself. That's not what partnership usually means. No, he said. It's not. But it's what I mean by it. Rose studied him. The numbers were running. She was checking and rechecking. She had been wrong before, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong, and she couldn't afford to be wrong again. You saw the bruise, she said. He didn't look away. Yes. And it's not my business unless you make it my business. His voice was level and plain. But I'll tell you this much. Whoever put it there isn't going to put another one on you. Not here. Not in this town. He paused. That's a promise, Miss Calloway. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. Rose said nothing. The key was warm now from her hand. I'll leave you to rest, Daniel said. He walked down the hall to the stairs, and she heard his boots on the steps, measured and unhurried, the steps of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. And then she heard the lobby door, and he was gone. Rose stepped into the room and turned the bolt. The click of it sliding home was the loudest sound she'd heard in days. She stood with her back against the door and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Just breathed. The room was small, and the light was going amber through the window. And somewhere down the street, a piano was playing something cheerful and out of tune. Normal sounds. Town sounds. Sounds that had nothing to do with her. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled back her sleeve and looked at the bruise. Harlan Voss had left it on a Thursday, the last Thursday of her old life. She had been standing in the front parlor of his house on Chestnut Street in Nashville, with a vase of cut flowers in her hands, because she'd moved them from the side table to the mantel and then back again, and he'd watched her do it and said, very quietly, the way he said everything, "Rose, did I tell you to move those flowers?" She hadn't answered fast enough. The vase had hit the floor. His hand had closed around her wrist before the pieces stopped sliding. Not shaking her, just holding. Just making sure she understood the precise dimensions of the space she was permitted to occupy. "I'll ask you again," Harlan had said. "Did I tell you to move them?" "No," she'd said. "I'm sorry." "I know you are." He'd released her wrist and stepped back and smoothed his jacket and said, "Clean that up," in the same tone of mild disappointment he might have used about weather. That had been 3 weeks ago. She had spent 2 of those weeks planning, and 1 of them moving. And now she was here, on the other side of the country, sitting on a bed in a locked room in Abilene, Kansas, and Harlan Voss was in Nashville, not knowing where she was. She pressed that thought flat and kept it there like a hand over a wound. He didn't know. He would look. He always looked. But he didn't know yet, and tonight that was enough. Tonight the door was locked, and she was the only one with the key, and a man she had met 2 hours ago had promised her something in a hallway, and she didn't trust the promise yet. She wasn't built for trust anymore. Trust had been a capacity she'd used up, but she had filed it away with the other evidence. The hands that had released her immediately, the voice that hadn't changed, the chair Billy Marsh had sat in when Daniel Holt looked at him. Numbers. Evidence. She was still running the calculation. Outside the window, the sun was going down over the Kansas plain, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the color orange. Streaks of it, violent and gorgeous. The kind of sky she'd never seen in Nashville, where the buildings cut the horizon into manageable pieces. Here, the horizon was the whole world, edge to edge, nothing between her and the end of it. She watched it until the orange burned down to purple and the purple went to black. Then she lay back on the bed, still dressed, her new key in her closed fist, and she let herself say the thing she hadn't allowed herself to say since Nashville. The thing that was true, whether she was ready to believe it yet or not. "I'm still here," she said quietly. To the ceiling, to the dark, to no one and everyone. "I'm still here." It wasn't hope exactly. It was something earlier than hope, something that came before hope. The raw material of it, the stubborn insistence on continuing that had kept her breathing through 4 years of a man who'd made breathing feel like a privilege he granted. She was still here, and tomorrow she would meet Daniel Holt in the daylight, and she would watch and listen and run her numbers, and she would decide. She alone would decide what she did next. Not Harlan, not the law, not a man with a contract and a paid passage and a claim on her time. Her, Rose Calloway, 24 years old and still breathing and still here. She closed her eyes, the key pressed into her palm, the bolt held firm across the door. For the first time in 2 years, she slept without listening for footsteps in the hall. She woke before dawn to the sound of a horse being walked out of the stable across the street, and for 3 full seconds she didn't know where she was. Her hand went flat against the mattress. Her eyes found the window. Her body was already coiled and ready for whatever came next before her mind caught up and reminded her. Locked door, iron bolt, Kansas, the key still pressed into the groove of her palm where she'd held it all night. She uncurled her fingers slowly. The key had left a mark. She lay still and listened to the town wake up around her. Boots on the boardwalk below. A woman calling out to someone across the street. The clank and clatter of the hotel kitchen starting breakfast 2 floors down. Ordinary sounds building on top of each other until they became the particular texture of a morning that had nothing to do with her old life, and she let herself feel the distance of that. 2,000 miles of rail and dust and stagecoach road between herself and the house on Chestnut Street. And she breathed it in like air after a long time underground. She dressed carefully. She pinned her hair back tight and checked the cuff buttons on both sleeves and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand for a long moment. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been running and had only just stopped long enough to realize how tired running had made her. But her eyes were clear, and her chin was level, and she had slept. Actually slept, unbroken and dreamless, for the first time and longer than she could calculate. She went downstairs. Nora Price was behind the counter writing something in a ledger, and she looked up when Rose came down and said, "Coffee's hot," without any particular surprise at the early hour, as if she'd known exactly when Rose would appear. "Thank you." Rose poured herself a cup from the pot on the sideboard and stood at the window that looked out onto the main street. The morning was clear and cold, the sky that particular pale blue that comes before the sun has fully committed to the day. "He's already been by," Nora said, without looking up from her ledger. Rose turned. "Mr. Holt?" 6 o'clock. Left something for you." Nora reached under the counter and produced a small folded note and slid it across without ceremony. Rose picked it up. The handwriting was economical, the same as his letters. No word wasted, no flourish for the sake of it. It said, "No obligations today. If you'd like to see the ranch, I'll be at the stable at 9. If you'd rather have the day to yourself, that's fine too. Either way, there's a good breakfast at the diner 2 doors down." D. Holt. Rose read it twice. She folded it and put it in her pocket. "He wrote me a note instead of knocking on my door?" she said. "Yes," Nora said. "At 6 in the morning he was already thinking about whether knocking on my door would be the wrong thing to do." Nora set her pen down and looked at her directly for the first time that morning. "I'm going to tell you something, and you can do what you like with it. Daniel Holt has been running that ranch alone since his wife died 3 years ago. He is not a man who does things without thinking them through first." She paused. He thought about that note. Rose looked out the window again. A wagon rolled past, the driver nodding at someone on the boardwalk. 2 women in bonnets talking outside the dry goods store. Regular morning, regular town, regular people with no idea that she was standing inside this building, recalculating everything she thought she knew about what a man could be. "The bruise," Rose said. She kept her voice even. "He saw it yesterday. He hasn't said a word about it." "No," Nora said. "He wouldn't." "Why not?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Because pushing a woman who's already been pushed isn't something Daniel Holt has any interest in doing." She picked up her pen again. "That's all I'll say about it. The rest is between you and him." Rose drank her coffee. She ate breakfast at the diner 2 doors down, eggs and biscuits and gravy, a quantity of food that would have made Harlan comment on her appetite with that particular gentle precision he used for observations that were not observations at all, but instructions. And no one at the diner commented on what she ate, or how she sat, or whether she was taking too long. The woman who served her refilled her coffee without being asked, and said, "You're the one staying at Nora's." And when Rose said yes, she said, "Welcome to Abilene," and meant it, and moved on. Small thing. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. At 9 o'clock she walked to the stable. Daniel was outside it, checking the harness on a pair of brown horses hitched to a wagon, running his hands along the leather, with the focused attention of a man who trusted his own inspection over everything else. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and something crossed his face. Not surprise, not relief exactly, something quieter than both of those. "Miss Calloway." "Mr. Holt." She stopped a few feet from him. "I got your note." "I figured you'd either come or you wouldn't," he said. "Didn't see much point in adding pressure to it." "Most men would have knocked." "Most men would have been thinking about themselves when they did it." He gave the harness one more check and straightened up. "I was thinking about you." The plain simplicity of that sat in the air between them. Rose looked at the horses rather than his face. "You have a good team," she said, because she needed a moment, and she needed it to not be obvious. "That's Gus and Clara. Clara's the one on the left. She'll try to set the pace if you let her. Gus doesn't care either way." He moved to the side of the wagon and offered his hand to help her up to the seat. She looked at it for just a half-second before she took it. She felt that half-second in her chest, felt herself choose it instead of recoil from it. And his grip was brief and impersonal, and he released it the moment she was seated. He climbed up on the other side and took the reins. The wagon seat was narrow enough that their shoulders were close, but he angled slightly away from her, and she noticed that too. Added it to the running count. "Ranch is about 40 minutes out," he said. "Road's decent this time of year." They rode in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, which surprised her. She had grown accustomed to silence being a weapon. Harlan's silences had been load-bearing structures, full of pressure and implication, silences that required her to fill them correctly or face the consequences of having filled them wrong. This silence was different. It was just 2 people on a wagon bench on a Kansas road in the early morning, and it asked nothing of her. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a mile or so. "You can ask me anything," Daniel said. The advertisement. You had it running for 3 months before I answered. Other women must have written to you. Some did. Why me? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, most of the letters I got were about what the women could offer. Cooking, sewing, managing a house. Which is fair enough. That's what I asked for. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. Your letter was different. I kept it short. I didn't have much to recommend me. You said you were looking for a place where the past couldn't follow you. He glanced at her, just briefly. I've looked for that myself. Figured I understood something about what you meant. Rose turned that over. Your wife, she said carefully. Losing her, he said. And losing the baby. And then spending a year wondering if I'd done something wrong. Something I should have caught sooner. Something that might have changed how it went. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you talk about a scar that's fully healed. Still there, still real, but not bleeding anymore. I built a new house on new land because I needed somewhere that didn't have her ghost in every room. That's my version of running from the past, I reckon. Did it work? Mostly. The ghost comes with you some, but it gets quieter. Rose looked out at the plain, stretching wide in every direction. The grass was dry and gold in the October light, and the sky was enormous. More sky than she had ever seen in one place. The kind of sky that made everything under it feel both very small and very free. I was married, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. But he had offered her something honest, and she found she wanted to meet it in kind. Not legally. We were... He called it an arrangement. He called everything an arrangement. I was 20 when my father died, and Harlan Voss was a friend of my father's, and he offered to help manage the estate, and then he offered to help manage me. She paused. I didn't understand what I was agreeing to until I was already inside it, and the door had closed. Daniel said nothing. He was listening in the way she had noticed he listened, fully, without interrupting, without preparing his response while she was still talking. He never hit me, she said. Not the way you're thinking. He was too careful for that. He used other things. Isolation. Control. The way he could make me feel like everything I did was slightly wrong, slightly insufficient, just enough to keep me always correcting, always adjusting, always trying to be whatever version of myself would finally be acceptable. She stopped. Her hands were flat on her thighs. The bruise was an exception. He lost his patience at the end. I think he knew I was planning to leave. The wagon moved over a ridge, and below them, set in a shallow valley with a line of cottonwoods along a creek, she saw the ranch. A solid 2-story house, whitewashed, with a barn to one side and a corral beyond it. Fenced pasture, where cattle grazed in the middle distance. It looked planted. It looked like something that intended to stay. I'm sorry, Daniel said, for what he did to you. Don't be sorry, Rose said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and softened it deliberately. I don't want sorry. I've had sorry from people who stood by and watched and were very sorry indeed and did nothing whatsoever about it. She looked at the ranch below them. I want to know if I'm trading one arrangement for another, or if what you wrote in those letters is real. Daniel pulled the horses to a stop on the ridge. He set the brake and turned on the seat to face her, and she made herself hold his gaze because she needed to see his face when he answered. I'll tell you what real looks like from where I'm sitting, he said. Real looks like you have your own room with your own lock, and I don't come through that door without an invitation. Real looks like you manage the house the way you see fit, and I don't second-guess you. Real looks like if something's wrong, you tell me, and I listen, and we work it out in words instead of instead of whatever it is you've been surviving. He held her gaze steady. And real looks like if you wake up one morning and decide this isn't right, and you want to go somewhere else, I'll put you on the stage with enough money to get there. No argument. No closed doors. Rose looked at him for a long moment. Why would you do that? Let me go, I mean. You've invested in this. Because a woman who stays somewhere she doesn't want to be isn't a partner, Daniel said. She's a prisoner. I've got no interest in that. Something moved through his expression. Something old and private. My mother stayed somewhere she didn't want to be for 17 years. I watched what that did to her. He turned back to the horses and released the brake. I swore a long time ago I wasn't going to be the reason a woman made that particular face. They drove down the ridge in silence. Rose sat with his words and did not try to process them too quickly. She had learned to be skeptical of good words. Harlan had been exceptional with words, smooth and precise and always exactly calibrated to what she needed to hear. But words delivered in private, in the dark, with no witnesses and no cost, were a different instrument than words delivered plainly on a wagon bench in the middle of the morning, where they could be measured against everything else she had observed. The hands that had released her, the voice that hadn't changed, the note instead of a knock, the distance he maintained on every seat and step and threshold, the promise made in a hallway and repeated now without embellishment or audience. The numbers were not wrong yet. She did not trust him. She was not built for trust anymore, not quickly, not without a long accumulation of proof. But she was beginning to believe that the calculation might eventually come out somewhere she hadn't expected. He showed her the ranch with the directness of a man who was not trying to impress her, but simply showing her the facts of the place. The house was clean and spare. The kitchen was stocked and organized. The upstairs room he led her to was plain. A bed, a wardrobe, a window seat that looked out over the plain. But the bolt on the door was new iron, and she recognized the same pale fresh wood around the screws as the one at the hotel. "You put this one in too," she said. "Figured if you decide to stay, the same rules apply here as at the hotel." He stood in the doorway with both hands in his pockets, not entering the room. "Your space, your lock, your key." Rose put her hand on the bolt and slid it across. It moved smoothly, solidly, with the specific satisfying click of something that would hold. She stood there with her palm flat against it and felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years, so completely that it took her a moment to name it. Safe. She felt, inside this room, with this bolt under her hand, something that approximated safety. She didn't say that. She turned around and said, "Show me the rest." He showed her the barn and the cattle and the chicken coop and the kitchen garden, mostly harvested now for winter, but still holding some root vegetables in the cold ground. He answered her questions directly and without condescension. How many head of cattle? What the winter feed situation looked like? Whether the well had ever frozen? What the nearest town was and how long the road took in bad weather? She asked them all, and he answered them all, and never once suggested she was asking too many or the wrong kind. On the walk back to the house, she said, "What do you actually need from a wife, Mr. Holt, specifically?" "Cooking and preserving. Help with the accounts. I can do figures, but I don't enjoy it. Someone to manage the house so I can manage the land." He paused. "Company. Honest conversation. Someone who tells me when I'm wrong." Another pause, shorter. "That's all." "That's not a small list." "No, but it's an honest one." She stopped walking. He stopped too, 3 feet from her, and waited. The wind moved across the plain and pressed the dry grass flat in long silver waves. "I'm going to tell you something, Mr. Holt, and I need you to hear it plainly." "All right." "I don't trust easily. I may not trust fully for a long time. I'll watch everything you do, and I'll be looking for the thing that proves I was wrong to come here. Because I've been wrong before, and it cost me considerably." She met his eyes. "That's not an accusation. It's just what's true, and I'd rather you know it than have you think I'm warming to this faster than I am." Daniel looked at her for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Truly. And for what it's worth, you should watch. You should take every piece of time you need." The corner of his mouth moved, barely, the ghost of something. "I'm not going anywhere." They drove back to Abilene in the late afternoon with the sun going low behind them and the shadow of the wagon stretching long ahead. Rose sat with her hands in her lap and watched the town grow closer and thought about a man who had installed 2 locks on 2 doors before she'd even told him she was afraid. She didn't say anything for most of the ride, but somewhere in the last mile, without deciding to, she moved one hand from her lap and set it on the seat between them. Not toward him, just open, just no longer held tight. Daniel didn't look at it, didn't comment, kept his eyes on the road and let Clara set the pace. But Rose noticed, with the particular precision of a woman who had learned to notice everything, that his shoulders had gone a fraction less rigid than they'd been all day. She filed that away too, added it to the count, kept running the numbers. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. Rose stopped counting after the first week because counting had been a survival mechanism, and she was beginning, slowly and with great suspicion, to wonder if survival was the only mode available to her, or if something else might eventually be permitted. She moved into the ranch on the 5th day, not because she had fully decided. She was careful with the word decided, careful not to let it feel heavier than she could carry, but because the hotel room was a holding place, and the ranch was a place where things happened, and she needed things to happen around her, or her mind would turn inward, and inward was not somewhere she could afford to spend too much time, yet. Daniel had said nothing when she came downstairs with her carpet bag and her trunk and told Nora Price she was checking out. Nora had looked at her for a long moment with those 50 years of conclusions eyes, and then said, "You know where I am." And Rose had understood that to mean something specific, and had said, "Yes, ma'am," and meant it back. Daniel had loaded her trunk without comment, and driven her out to the ranch in the same quiet he used for most things. And when they arrived, he had carried the trunk upstairs, set it at the foot of the bed in the room with the bolt on the door, and said, "I'll be in the barn if you need anything," and left her to it. She unpacked slowly. She had so little that the unpacking took no time at all, which made the room's emptiness feel large and deliberate. A wardrobe with 3 dresses in it, a dresser with a hairbrush that had been her mother's, and a small book of psalms her father had given her when she was 9. A trunk that was mostly air now. Everything she owned in the world, and it filled less than a quarter of the space available to her. She stood at the window seat and looked out at the plain and thought, I could acquire things here. I could fill this room with things that are mine. The thought was so unfamiliar, it was almost dizzying. The days settled into a rhythm that felt nothing like the rhythms she had known before. She cooked breakfast, and Daniel ate it without commentary on what she'd made, or how she'd made it, or whether the eggs were slightly overdone, which they were the first 2 mornings, until she learned the stove's temperament. She managed the house, and he managed the land, and they intersected at meals and in the evenings, and sometimes in the kitchen when he came in for water mid-afternoon, and she was working at the table, and they talked. Carefully at first, then more naturally. The way 2 people talk when they are slowly learning the grammar of each other. She learned that he took his coffee black and strong, and that he was incapable of reading in a chair without eventually sliding down until he was at a 45-degree angle. She learned that he had a dry humor. He deployed quietly and without announcement. so that she was halfway through her response before she realized he'd been funny. She learned that he talked to his horses by name while he worked. Full sentences, as if they had opinions worth consulting. She did not learn these things because she was falling for him. She was not falling for anything. She was observing, cataloging, running numbers. That was all. That was what she told herself. On a Thursday morning, 10 days after she'd moved in, she was in the kitchen doing accounts at the table when she heard a horse come into the yard at speed. Not Daniel's horse. She knew Daniel's horse's approach by now, the particular rhythm of it. And the pace was wrong, urgent, the kind of pace that preceded news. She heard Daniel come out of the barn. She heard a man's voice, one she didn't recognize, and Daniel's answer, and then the other voice again, lower and faster. She put down her pen. Daniel came through the back door and stood in the kitchen doorway, and his face was the same steady face it always was, except that something behind his eyes had changed, tightened, the way the air tightens before weather. "There's a man at Nora's hotel," he said. "Arrived on this morning's stage. He's been asking around town about you." Rose's pen rolled off the table. She didn't move to pick it up. She felt the blood leave her face in a single, slow wave. What does he look like? Well-dressed, gray hair. From Tennessee by his voice, the fellow says. Daniel kept his eyes on her face. "You know who that is." It wasn't a question. She nodded. "All right." He came into the kitchen and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Same as he sat every morning. Same unhurried set to his shoulders. "Tell me what you need me to do." Rose pressed her hands flat on the table. The numbers were gone. The careful, rational arithmetic that had carried her through 4 years and 2,000 miles had evaporated completely, and what was left was just raw animal fear, the kind that lived in the body before the mind had a chance to intervene. She could hear her own breathing. "Rose." His voice was quiet and direct. "Look at me." She looked at him. "He does not have legal authority over you," Daniel said. "You are 24 years old, and you are my wife, and you are standing on my land in Abilene, Kansas, and whatever papers he's carrying from Nashville do not change those facts. Do you understand me?" "He'll have a lawyer," she said. "He always has a lawyer. He knows how to make things look a certain way on paper. He's very good at it. He's been doing it for years, and no one ever—" She stopped. Her voice had started to shake, and she would not let it shake. She pressed her hands harder into the table. "No one ever questioned him because he's Harlan Voss, and he has money and standing, and he speaks very well in front of people who don't know what he is. Then we'll find someone who can question him." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I want you to hear me clearly. You are not going back to Nashville. You are not going anywhere you don't choose to go. I'm going to go into town right now, and I'm going to speak to Judge Caraway, who comes through Abilene every month and happens to be due today. And I'm going to make sure that whatever Harlan Voss thinks he has in those papers gets looked at by someone who knows the law better than he does." He paused. "But I need you to stay here. And I need you to not let fear make your decisions. Can you do that?" Rose looked at him across the kitchen table. This man she had known for 10 days. This man whose coffee she had made 12 times, and whose accounts she had balanced twice, and whose horses she had learned by name. This man who knocked before entering rooms and sat in doorways instead of walking through them, and had put locks on 2 doors before she'd asked for a single thing. "I'll come with you," she said. "Rose, I said I'll come with you." She pushed back from the table and stood up, and her legs were steadier than she expected. "I am done hiding in rooms and waiting for other people to manage Harlan Voss for me. I've been doing that for 4 years, and it has not worked." She picked up her pen from the floor and set it on the table with a precision that was really about having something to do with her hands. "I'll get my coat." He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she was learning, the one that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, but something in the territory between them. Then he said, "All right," and stood up. They rode into Abilene side by side. Rose on the gentle mare Daniel had been teaching her to ride, and she kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she thought about her father, who had been a small man with a quiet voice and a complete absence of fear. And she thought about what he had said to her once when she was 12, and a girl at school had been cruel to her for a week running. He had said, "The only power a bully keeps is the power you let them hold for you. You take it back by looking them in the eye." She had forgotten that for 4 years. She was remembering it now. Harlan Voss was on the porch of Nora's hotel when they rode in. He was sitting in one of the wooden chairs as if he'd ordered it placed there specifically for him. One leg crossed over the other, hat on his knee, still handsome, still composed, still wearing money the way some men wore it, as an argument you couldn't win. He looked up when he heard the horses, and his face did the thing it always did when he looked at her. A small, private satisfaction, visible only if you knew to look for it. The expression of a man who has located a thing that belongs to him. Rose kept her eyes on his face and felt her heart rate spike and held it and kept riding. She dismounted before Daniel could help her, which was not stubbornness but necessity. She needed the ground under her own feet for this, needed to have put herself there by her own action. She looped the reins over the post and turned to face him. "Harlan," she said. "Rose." He stood, unhurried, and put his hat back on. "You look well. The journey agreed with you." He said it the way he said everything, pleasantly, with a warmth that was engineered rather than felt. His eyes moved to Daniel, assessed him the way he assessed everything, for leverage, for weakness, for utility. "You must be the man she contracted herself to."
"Holt, is it?" "That's right," Daniel said.
He had come to stand beside Rose, not in front of her, beside her, shoulder level, close enough that she could feel the solidity of him, without him blocking her sight line or her ability to speak. "Well," Harlan smiled, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Rose isn't free to contract herself to anyone. She has obligations she left unfulfilled in Nashville, and a legal arrangement that predates your correspondence." He reached into his coat. "I have documentation." "I'm sure you do," Daniel said. "Judge Carraway's at the courthouse. You can show it to him." Something shifted in Harlan's expression. Just briefly. Just the faintest recalculation. "A judge isn't necessary. This is a family matter." "Rose is my family," Daniel said. "So it involves me, which makes it a legal matter. We'll take it to the judge." A small crowd had begun to accumulate on the edges of the scene, with the efficient invisibility of small-town people who know how to watch without appearing to watch. Rose could see Nora Price in the hotel doorway. She could see Tom Whitaker, not laughing now, just watching. She could see the woman from the diner who had refilled her coffee without being asked. Harlan looked at Rose with the particular patience of a man who has never had to raise his voice, because the threat is always implicit. "Rose, you know how this ends. Come home with me now, and I'll consider the matter settled. Make this into something public, and I'll be forced to pursue it in a way that won't be pleasant for you." Rose felt the pull of it. She had felt that pull for 4 years. The gravitational force of just surrendering, just capitulating, just making herself small enough to fit back into the space he designated for her. Because the alternative always cost more than she felt she had. She felt it now, as strong and familiar as breathing. She let herself feel it. And then she spoke. "I want you to listen to me carefully," she said. Her voice came out level, She had not known it would. "Because I am going to say this once, and I am not going to repeat it." She watched his face. "You don't have authority over me. You never had the kind you pretended to have. What you had was isolation. You made sure I had nowhere to go, and no one to go to, and no money of my own, and no voice that anyone would listen to. That was never authority. That was a cage." She paused. "I'm not in the cage anymore." Harlan's composure thinned very slightly at the edges. "You're being dramatic, Rose. You were always prone to—" "I have a bruise on my wrist that is still yellow at the edges," she said. "Would you like me to show the people standing on this street exactly how it's shaped?" Silence. The particular quality of silence that happens when a room, or a street, collectively stops pretending not to listen. Harlan Voss went very still. She had seen him go still like that before, and it had always preceded something she didn't want to see. And her body remembered that, and sent the signal to run. But she held her ground, because she was not 20 years old anymore, and she was not alone in his parlor, and the street was full of witnesses. "I have documentation," he said again, but his voice had lost the pleasantness. "Then bring it to the judge," Daniel said, "and let him read it." Judge Carraway was a man of 60, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the manner of someone who had been listening to people misrepresent situations for so long that he could identify a misrepresentation before the first sentence was finished. He read Harlan's documents at his desk in the small courthouse with everyone present. Harlan, Daniel, Rose, and Nora Price, who had appeared and simply sat down in the corner chair in a way that made it clear she was not leaving. The judge read for a long time. He turned pages. He went back to earlier pages. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them and put them back on and read a section again. Then he set the papers flat on the desk and looked at Harlan Voss. "These documents establish a business arrangement entered into between yourself and Miss Rose Calloway, dated 4 years ago," he said. "They do not constitute legal guardianship. They do not supersede her right to marry. And they contain no enforceable claim on her person or her location." He folded his hands. "What exactly did you expect these to accomplish, Mr. Voss?" Harlan's mouth opened, closed. "Furthermore," the judge continued, with the measured pace of a man who is not finished, "I have in the last hour spoken with 3 individuals in this town who observed your conduct on the porch of the hotel not 1 hour ago, including what appears to be an implicit threat directed at Mrs. Holt." He looked at Harlan over the top of the spectacles. "I would advise you strongly to conclude your business in Abilene and return to Nashville on tomorrow morning's stage." "She owes me," Harlan said. And there it was, finally, stripped of the pleasantness and the engineering and the careful precision, just the raw claim underneath all of it. "She is mine. She owes me. 4 years I kept her, fed her, housed her, managed her father's estate." "With my father's money," Rose said. "Which you helped yourself to for 4 years without accounting for a penny of it." Harlan turned to look at her, and his face was a face she had never seen in public. The face she had only seen in private rooms when the doors were closed. The face behind the pleasant, calibrated mask. And she looked directly at it, and she did not look away. "You have nothing," he said quietly, just for her. "Without me, you have nothing. You think this man and this town are going to sustain you? You think this is real?" "Yes," she said, "I do." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Daniel, who had been standing beside her through all of it, with his hands loose at his sides and his face saying nothing and everything. And whatever he saw in Daniel's face settled something in his calculation. He picked up his papers from the judge's desk. "I'll be on the morning stage," he said to no one in particular, and walked out. The door closed behind him, and Rose stood in the small courthouse in Abilene, Kansas, with her heart slamming against her ribs and her hands shaking so hard she pressed them against her skirt to still them. And she waited for the feeling of having won to arrive. What arrived instead was something more complicated. Relief so vast it was almost grief. The loosening of a tension she had held for so long it had become structural. The way you don't know how much you've been bracing until the thing you were bracing against finally moves away. Her eyes were burning and she would not cry. She absolutely would not cry in this courthouse in front of these people. But the burning was there and she could not make it stop. "Mrs. Holt." Judge Carraway's voice was gentle, which she hadn't expected from him. "You did a brave thing just now." Rose pressed her lips together and nodded, because speaking was not available to her at the moment. She felt Daniel's hand, not grabbing, not gripping, not holding her in place. His hand at the small of her back, barely there, the lightest possible point of contact, just enough to say, "I'm here, still here, nothing more required." She breathed. Outside, Nora Price walked past her toward the door and stopped and put one hand briefly on Rose's arm and said, "That's what taking it back looks like," and kept walking. Rose stood in the courthouse with Daniel's hand at her back and the burning in her eyes, and the vast, complicated relief moving through her like a weather system. And she thought about her father's voice, small and quiet, the way she'd almost forgotten it. "The only power a bully keeps is the power you let them hold for you." She had let Harlan Voss hold it for 4 years. She had just taken it back. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the sun at a low angle that made everything gold and long-shadowed, and Rose did not speak for most of the ride, and Daniel did not require her to. That was one of the things she had cataloged about him. He did not fill silence to manage his own discomfort. He let it be what it needed to be, and waited for her to come back from wherever she'd gone. She came back somewhere in the last mile. "He'll go home," she said. Not a question exactly, more like a thing she was testing the weight of out loud. "He'll go home," Daniel said. "He's not finished being angry." "No, but angry in Nashville is different from angry in Abilene." He kept his eyes on the road. "He's got no ground to stand on here." Carraway made that plain enough. Rose turned the afternoon over in her mind. The courthouse. Harlan's face when the mask had slipped. Her own voice coming out level when she'd had no reason to expect it would. She kept returning to that. The steadiness of her own voice. The way it had not shaken. As if something in her had quietly decided, in the middle of everything, that she was done being afraid of Harlan Voss, specifically, even if she was not yet done being afraid in general. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right." "When he was talking, when he said, 'I owe him,'" she paused, forming it. "You didn't say anything. You just stood there." "Yes." "Why?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Because it wasn't my speech to give," he said. "He wasn't talking to me, and you didn't need me to answer for you." Rose looked at the side of his face. She had been looking at the side of his face for 10 days now, in the mornings at breakfast, and in the evenings by the fire, and on this wagon bench on this road. And she was beginning to know it the way you know a landscape you've crossed enough times to stop needing a map. The particular set of his jaw, the line where his hat sat, the way concentration looked different from concern on him, though both were quiet. "Most men would have answered for me," she said. "Most men would have been more interested in Harlan Voss than in you." He glanced at her. "I was interested in you." She looked away before he could see what that did to her face. The ranch was quiet when they arrived, the way it was always quiet in the late afternoon, before the evening sound started. The cattle settling in the pasture, the horses in the barn shifting their weight, the particular creak of the cottonwoods along the creek when the wind moved through them. Rose had started to love this hour, to love it. She unsaddled her mare without being asked and brushed her down while Daniel did the same for his horse in the next stall. And they worked in parallel with only the width of a partition between them and the comfortable synchrony of people who have been occupying the same space long enough to stop interfering with each other. "I'm going to make supper," Rose said when she was done. "You don't have to. Not tonight. After a day like—" "I want to," she said. "I need something to do with my hands." He understood that. He nodded and let her go. She made a pot of beef stew with the last of the root vegetables from the garden and cornbread in the cast-iron skillet. And she worked methodically and let the rhythm of it settle her nervous system back into something functional. Chop, stir, measure. The stove's heat against her face, the smell of browning onion and dried thyme, the ordinary, reliable chemistry of food coming together from separate things. By the time Daniel came in from closing up the barn, she had the table set and the food on it, and she was standing at the window with a cup of water, watching the first stars come through. "Smells good," he said. "Sit down." They ate. The stew was better than anything she'd made yet. She'd finally understood the stove. And Daniel said so, plainly, without performance, the same way he acknowledged most good things, as a fact worth stating. They talked some. Not about Harlan, not about the courthouse, not about any of it. They talked about the cattle, about a fence in the north pasture that needed attention before the ground froze, about whether the winter was going to come early this year, based on the thickness of the woolly bear caterpillars Daniel had seen crossing the road last week, which was apparently a legitimate method of forecasting in Kansas. Rose found herself laughing at something he said about the caterpillars. It surprised her. Not the laugh itself, but the ease of it. The way it came without calculation, without checking first to see if laughter was permitted. She noticed that she'd noticed it, filed it away with the rest. After supper, he washed the dishes without discussion, which he'd started doing on the third day, and she'd stopped protesting by the fifth. And she sat at the kitchen table with the account book and finished what she'd been working on that morning, before the rider had come in at speed with the news that had restructured the day. The numbers were simple and clean. The ranch was not wealthy, but it was solid. More solid than it looked, actually, because Daniel had been meticulous about keeping costs low and debt lower, and his record-keeping was precise, if not elegant. She had found 3 places in the first week where his method could be improved, and had improved them without asking. And when he'd sat down with the books the next morning, he'd looked at what she'd done and said, "That's better," and moved on, which was the correct response. She was good at this. She had forgotten she was good at this. Harlan had managed all financial matters himself because control over money was control over everything, and she had watched him do it for 4 years and understood everything about it and been permitted to touch none of it. Sitting here with these books and making them better was a small thing in the register of the day, but it was hers. When the fire in the hearth had burned down to coals and the clock on the mantel said 8:30, Daniel put down the almanac he'd been reading and said, "You should rest. Today was a lot." "I'm not tired," Rose said, which was not true, but was true in the sense that her body was too alert still for sleep, too full of the residue of the afternoon. "Then come sit by the fire instead of working." He said it mildly, not a command, more like a suggestion that had her interests in it rather than his. She closed the account book and came and sat in the chair across from him, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the coals shifted and settled, and the wind had come up outside and was doing something low and persistent against the eaves. "I need to tell you something," Rose said eventually. "All right." She looked at the coals. "When I wrote to you, when I answered your advertisement," she picked her words slowly, "I wasn't completely honest about my situation. I know, he said. She looked at him. You know? I knew something was wrong before you arrived. The line in your letter, about looking for somewhere the past couldn't follow you. He set the almanac on the side table. That's not what a woman writes when she's leaving a good life. That's what she writes when she's leaving something she had to survive. He met her eyes. I didn't know the specifics, but I knew enough. You brought me here anyway. I brought you here because of it, he said. Because somebody needed to. He said it simply, without weight on it, as if it were just the logical conclusion of the arithmetic. And because your letter was the only one I got from a woman who didn't seem to want anything from me except exactly what I offered. Rose turned that over. I was also running, she said. I wasn't coming toward anything. I was going away from something. That's not the same as genuinely choosing this. No, he agreed. It's not the same. But it's where a lot of choices start. Running from something and finding something worth staying for. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He paused. Are you finding anything worth staying for? The fire cracked. The wind pushed at the eaves. Rose looked at this man across the hearth. This man who had caught her before she fell, and not mentioned what he'd seen. Who had installed locks on doors before she'd asked for anything. Who had stood beside her in a courthouse and let her speak for herself, when speaking for herself was the thing she needed most. And she felt the arithmetic shifting in a way she had been resisting for days. Yes, she said, carefully. I think I am. Something in his face, not a smile, something quieter than a smile, something that lived underneath a smile, came and went. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. She went to bed an hour later and lay in the dark with the bolt turned and the sound of the wind and the faraway low sound of cattle. And she did the thing she had promised herself she would not do yet, which was let herself want this. Let herself want the ranch and the kitchen and the account books and the evenings by the fire. Let herself want the particular quality of safety that existed in this house, which was nothing like the safety of locks and distance, but something more like the safety of being genuinely seen by someone who intended to go on seeing you. She pressed her face into the pillow and let herself want it all, and it was terrifying, and it was also the most alive she had felt in 4 years. The next morning she came downstairs, and Daniel was at the table with his coffee, and he looked up when she came in and said, "Morning," and she said, "Morning," and she put the coffee on for herself, and the day began, and it was ordinary in every particular, and she felt the ordinariness of it like water after thirst. November came in cold and fast. The first frost turned the grass silver in the mornings, and the sky took on that particular high Kansas blue that was almost painful to look at directly. Rose learned the rhythm of the cold, how to bank the fire at night so the kitchen was still warm at dawn, how to break the ice on the water trough before Daniel had to, how to layer clothes for outdoor work without sacrificing the ability to actually move in them. Daniel taught her to ride properly, not the tentative led around the corral version of her first days, but actual riding, how to move with the horse instead of against it, how to communicate through the reins without pulling, how to read what the animal was telling you through its ears and the set of its neck. She was a quick study, quicker than either of them expected, and the first morning she rode out alone to check the water situation in the east pasture, and came back without incident. She felt a satisfaction in her chest that was close to pride. She told him about Nashville in pieces, not all at once, not with any plan to tell him everything, just pieces surfacing naturally in the course of days and conversations, the way stones surface in a field after rain. He received each piece the same way, without drama, without the particular hungry attention that some people brought to other people's suffering, as if it were something they needed to consume. He received it and held it and moved on, and she trusted him more for the moving on than she would have for any amount of careful handling. She told him about her father one evening, about the congregation he'd built from nothing in a neighborhood nobody else wanted, about his voice on Sunday mornings, which she could still hear if she closed her eyes and let herself, about the way he'd died suddenly between 1 week and the next, and left her at 20 with no money, no family, no plan, and Harlan Voss standing in the parlor with a kind expression and a document he said was just paperwork. Daniel listened to all of it. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father sounds like he was worth knowing." "He was the best person I ever knew," she said, "until recently." She heard what she'd said. She did not take it back. Daniel looked at the fire. A muscle moved in his jaw. He said nothing, but the nothing was full of something, and Rose sat with it and let it be full. He touched her for the first time on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after her arrival, on an afternoon when she'd been working in the cold garden trying to turn the last of the soil before it froze solid, and she'd stood up too fast and gone dizzy and stumbled, and he had caught her elbow, the same way he'd caught her arms that first day off the stagecoach, the same firm, immediate grip. But this time she didn't go rigid. This time her body recognized the hands and let them hold her without preparing for what came next. He noticed. She knew he noticed, because she felt it in the way he released her. Slowly this time, not immediately, with a deliberateness that meant he was aware of the difference. "All right," he said. "Stood up too fast," she said. "I'm fine." He released her elbow and stepped back to his proper distance, and she looked at him and said, "Thank you." And he nodded and went back to what he'd been doing, and that was all. But that evening, at supper, she sat down across from him, and when he passed her the bread, she let her fingers brush his when she took it, and did not pull back immediately. A small thing, barely a thing. He passed the butter without comment and asked her what she wanted to do about the fence in the north pasture, and she told him, and they made a plan, and the meal continued. But the numbers had changed. She could feel them changing. The long, slow tilt of a calculation that had been running for weeks finally arriving somewhere she'd been approaching without looking directly at. She lay in bed that night, and the thought she'd been keeping at careful arm's length walked straight up and sat down in the center of her mind and refused to be managed. She was in love with Daniel Holt. She did not know when it had happened. It had not been one moment, but an accumulation of moments, a long, patient layering of evidence that had finally reached the weight of certainty. The way he moved through the world, with that particular quality of quietness that was not absence, but presence, entirely, consistently present. The way he had looked at Harlan Voss's face and not blinked. The way he laughed at his own terrible jokes about caterpillar weather forecasting, and then looked faintly embarrassed about it. The way he had said, "I was thinking about you," on a wagon bench in the October morning, and meant it simply, without strategy. She was in love with him, and she was terrified of it in a way that was different from every other fear she'd carried. The other fears had been about pain, about loss, about the specific damage one person could do to another. This fear was about something else entirely. The particular vulnerability of wanting something good, of believing you deserve it, of opening your hands and holding something precious, and knowing that the very act of holding it made it possible to lose it. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and felt her own heartbeat, and talked herself through it the way she'd been talking herself through hard things for years. You are 24 years old. You are in a locked room on your own land. You have survived the unsurvivable and come out the other side. And the man in the room below you has given you every reason to trust him, and no reason not to. You are allowed to want this. The thought sat quiet and radical in the dark. You are allowed to want this. She fell asleep, holding it. In the morning, she came downstairs and Daniel was at the stove. He'd gotten there first, which happens sometimes, and the coffee was already made, and he had his back to her and was doing something with the skillet. He heard her step on the last stair and said, without turning, "Eggs are almost ready. Cold morning." "How cold?" she said. "Ice on the trough. Winter's making up its mind." She poured her coffee and stood at the window, and the world outside was white-edged and brilliant, every surface furred with frost, the sky a deep, clear blue above it all. Beautiful and cold and enormous, the way Kansas was always enormous, the way it had seemed impossible to her when she'd arrived, and had slowly become something she could not imagine living without. "Daniel," she said. He turned from the stove, looked at her. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked back at him across the kitchen and let him see what was in her face, without managing it or moderating it, or calculating what it cost to let him see it. For once, she just let her face say what was true. He went still, the way he'd gone still that first day on the street with the stagecoach dust still in the air between them. But this stillness was different. This stillness was not about something wrong. This was the stillness of a man who was being very careful not to move too fast towards something he wants very much. "Rose," he said carefully. "I know," she said. "I know it's been 3 weeks. I know that's not much time." She set her coffee cup down on the windowsill. "But I have been running numbers on you since the moment you caught me off that stagecoach. And I want you to know that the numbers are not wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, something she hadn't seen before, something unguarded and entirely real. Then he said, very quietly, "They're not wrong on my side either." She crossed the kitchen. She stopped 2 feet from him, and she reached out and put her hand against his jaw. Not grabbed, not gripped, just her palm against the rough morning stubble of his face. The first time she had touched him with intention and choice and nothing else. And she felt him go absolutely still beneath her hand, holding himself in careful check, waiting, giving her every second she needed. "I'm choosing this," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because I'm afraid of what's behind me." She held his gaze. "Because of you. Because of who you are. I'm choosing this because of you." His hand came up and covered hers where it rested against his jaw, warm and rough, and the most careful grip she had ever felt. The grip of a man who understood, in his bones, the difference between holding and trapping. "I've been waiting," he said, "since the first morning you came downstairs and made coffee without asking if you were allowed to, for you to be ready to say something like that." Rose laughed. It surprised them both, the sudden brightness of it in the cold morning kitchen, the way it broke whatever remaining tension had been living in the air between them. "You could have said something yourself," she said. "No." He shook his head. "It had to be you." She understood that. She understood it completely. It had to be her because that was the whole point, that she was a person who got to decide things, who got to choose her own life, who got to say yes from a place of genuine freedom rather than manufactured consent. He had understood that from the beginning. He had organized everything around it from the beginning. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was brief and certain, the kiss of 2 people who have been arriving somewhere for a long time and have finally arrived. He kissed her back with a gentleness that held everything he'd been keeping at careful distance for 3 weeks. And when they broke apart, his forehead came down against hers, and they stood in the kitchen with the eggs going slightly too long in the skillet, and the frost brilliant on the window, and the enormousness of Kansas in every direction outside. "The eggs are burning," she said. "I know," he said, and did not move. She laughed again, and this time it did not surprise her at all. The burned eggs became a joke between them. Not a big joke, not one that required explanation or setup, just a shorthand that meant something private, the kind that only develops between two people who have been paying close attention to each other. When something went slightly wrong in the kitchen, Rose would say, "Well, it's not the eggs." And Daniel would get that expression that was not quite a smile, but lived right next to one. And that was the whole of it. And it was enough. November deepened. The cold settled in with the particular permanence of a Kansas winter that has decided it is staying. And the days shortened until the light was a brief and precious thing in the middle of the dark. They worked the ranch together the way the ranch needed. Rose managing the house and the accounts, and increasingly the chickens, which he had developed strong opinions about. And Daniel managing the land and the cattle, and the endless maintenance that a working ranch required. They intersected constantly and productively, and the house, which Daniel had described as lonely every way but outright, had stopped being lonely in a way that neither of them said directly, but both of them felt in every room. At night, they sat by the fire and talked. This was the thing Rose had not expected. Not the ease of working alongside him, which she had catalogued and credited, but the ease of talking to him. She had spent 4 years editing herself into a smaller and smaller version, trimming away opinions and observations and humor and any quality that Harlan had found inconvenient, until she had sometimes wondered in the dark whether there was a self left underneath all the trimming. Daniel Holt had a way of asking questions that assumed she had something worth saying, and waiting for the answer with genuine interest, and responding as if her answer had informed his thinking. She had been so starved of that particular quality of attention that the first few times it happened, she hadn't trusted it. By now, she had stopped being surprised by it and started just accepting it as the fact of him. She told him things she hadn't told anyone. About the year after her father died, when she'd moved through the world like a person who'd lost the instructions for it. About the books she'd loved before Harlan had found reasons to discourage reading. Too much time alone, too many ideas. And the ones she'd read in secret after that, borrowed from Edith Crane's library during the brief windows Harlan hadn't sealed off. About the specific dream she'd had with some regularity since she was a girl, which was simply this: a house of her own, with a garden and a room full of light, where she could read without listening for footsteps. "That's not a complicated dream," Daniel said one evening, when she told him that. "No," she agreed, "but complicated people can make simple things impossible." He had gone quiet, the way he did when something landed in him. Then he'd gotten up and come back from his room with a catalog, Agricultural and Household Goods, a Chicago company, and set it in her lap and said, "Mark anything you want for the house. We'll order it when the roads are passable." And he'd sat back down and picked up his almanac as if that were the end of the discussion. She had looked at the catalog for a long time before she understood that he was serious. Then she'd picked up the pencil from the side table and opened the first page. She ordered curtain fabric and 2 new lamps and a rug for the bedroom that was blue and cream. She almost put the pencil down before the rug, but she didn't. She marked it and moved on. She ordered a crate of books from a bookseller in the back pages. She almost put the pencil down before the books, too. She didn't do that, either. When she handed the catalog back to Daniel with her marks in the margins, she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything. Just looked at her choices and nodded and set the catalog on the table to deal with in the morning. And Rose sat with the fire and felt the particular sensation of having occupied space she was entitled to occupy and not apologized for it. She was learning to do that. It was slow work, unlearning 4 years of contraction. Sometimes she still caught herself going small automatically, editing herself mid-sentence, waiting for the thing she'd said to land wrong. But the thing about Daniel was that things didn't land wrong with him. Not because he agreed with everything, he didn't. He had clear opinions and stated them directly. But because disagreement with him never had any edge of danger in it. He said what he thought. She said what she thought. They figured out where the thing actually sat between them, and then they moved on. That was it. That was all it was. It seemed almost embarrassingly simple after 4 years of treating every conversation like a minefield. Nora Price came out to the ranch twice in November, both times under the premise of returning something borrowed and staying for 3 hours, which Rose had come to understand was how Nora checked on people she decided to keep track of. The second visit, she sat at the kitchen table while Rose made coffee and said, without any particular preamble, "You look different." "Different how?" Rose said. "Like you live here," Nora said, "instead of like you're waiting to be asked to leave." Rose set the coffee in front of her and sat down across from her and thought about that. "I'm still running numbers," she admitted. "I still catch myself checking for the catch." "That'll take longer to stop," Nora said. "That's not a character flaw. It's just sense. Took me 2 years after my first husband died before I stopped expecting everything good to come with conditions." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "The difference is, you've started to believe the numbers when they come out right. I can see it." Rose looked at her. "How can you see it?" "You made that coffee without asking if it was all right to use his coffee," Nora said. "First time I came, you asked. Today, you just made it." She took a sip. "That's not a small thing." It wasn't. Rose knew it wasn't. The curtains arrived in December, along with the lamps and the rug and the crate of books, on the supply wagon that came through from Abilene, on the first clear road after 2 weeks of cold that had kept everything still and close. Daniel brought the boxes in from the wagon and set them in the parlor without opening them, and said, "They're yours. You put them where you want them," and went back out to the barn. Rose opened the crate of books first. She sat on the parlor floor for 20 minutes, going through them, reading the titles with her hands. The particular pleasure of handling books she'd chosen herself, which was a pleasure she had forgotten was possible. When Daniel came back in from the barn an hour later, she was on her knees hanging the curtains, and he stood in the doorway and looked at the room, and then looked at her and said, very quietly, "That's better." "The light's better with the blue," she said, which was true, and also not quite what either of them was talking about. Christmas came and went, simply. A meal they cooked together, a small exchange of things. Daniel giving her a good pair of riding gloves that fit her hands precisely, which meant he had measured her hands without her noticing, which she thought about for a long time after. She gave him a new journal for the ranch accounts, the kind with the heavy binding that would hold up to being opened and closed daily for a year. And inside the front cover she had written, in her careful hand, "For the record of a good life being built." He read it standing at the table and was quiet for a long moment and then said, "Thank you, Rose," in a voice that meant considerably more than the words. January arrived with a blizzard that sealed them in for 4 days, the snow piling against the windows until the light came in gray and soft as wool. They were not sealed in badly. The pantry was full, the woodpile was covered, the animals were secured. But 4 days of close quarters with another person was a test of a kind they hadn't faced yet, and Rose noted on the second day that they had passed it without friction, without the particular tension that builds when two people can't escape each other and discover they've been performing ease rather than actually having it. They played cards. They read to each other by the fire. She read to him from one of her new books, a novel set in Scotland, with a heroine who had very strong opinions about everything. And Daniel sat with his long legs stretched toward the fire and listened, and occasionally said something dry and perceptive about the characters that made her lose her place. On the third evening, he got his guitar out from wherever he kept it and played, badly but earnestly. And when she started humming along to something she recognized, he looked up with that expression that was not quite a smile and kept playing. On the fourth evening, the last evening of the storm, Rose was sitting at the kitchen table mending a shirt of his that had given way at the shoulder, and Daniel was reading at the table across from her, and she looked up from her work and found him looking at her. Not the checked, careful look she'd gotten in the early weeks, just looking, openly, with that quality of attention he'd always had but had been careful about directing too directly for too long. Now he wasn't being careful about it, and she held his gaze without managing her own face, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table, in the lamplight, while the storm wound down outside, and she thought, "This is what it's supposed to be. This is the thing that was always supposed to be possible, and that I spent 4 years believing was just a story people told." "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." "Are you happy?" She held the shirt still in her hands and turned the word over, checked it against the actual state of things. Not the word happiness as she'd understood it before, which had been an absence of bad things, a temporary reprieve. The word as it actually meant, a presence, an active condition, something with its own weight and warmth. "Yes," she said, and then, because it deserved the whole truth, "I'm not finished being afraid. It still comes up. Last week when you raised your voice at the cattle, I felt it for a second, before I remembered it wasn't directed at me." "I know," he said. "I saw it. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for it." His voice was quiet and direct. "I'd rather know than not know. You promised me honesty. That's honesty." He set the almanac down. "I'm going to raise my voice at the cattle again, because they are deeply uncooperative animals, and they deserve it. But I want you to know that it's only ever going to be the cattle." She laughed. She couldn't help it. "The cattle. And occasionally the fence posts," he said, "when I hit them with the hammer wrong. I'll try to remember the fence posts are not me." "They're categorically not you," he said. And the way he said it, the precise, absolute certainty of it, landed in her chest and sat there warm. She set the mending down. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, casting its small circle, and the storm had gone quiet outside, and the house held them both in its solid, reliable walls. And she thought about a girl of 20 sitting in a parlor in Nashville, while a man she hadn't understood yet offered her help, and she had taken it, and that had been the beginning of the longest dark of her life. And she thought about a woman of 24, sitting at a kitchen table in Abilene, Kansas, mending a man's shirt by choice, looking at a face she had come to know and trust and love, and this being the end of that dark, and the beginning of something else entirely. "I want to say something," she said. "All right." "When I answered your advertisement, I wasn't choosing you. I was choosing away from him. I told you that, and I meant it, and it was true." She held his eyes. "But I've been thinking about when it changed, when I started choosing toward instead of away. And I think it was the morning I came downstairs, and you'd already made coffee, and you said, 'Good morning,' and then you asked me what I thought we should do about the cattle rotation, and you actually waited for my answer." She paused. "That was when I started choosing toward." Daniel looked at her steadily. "That was the third morning," he said. "I know." "You'd been here 3 days." "I know." I told you the numbers moved fast. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I spent 4 years shrinking myself into whatever shape Harlan required. You spent 3 weeks expanding the space around me and asking me to fill it. Do you understand how different that is? Do you understand what it did? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had that quality she'd heard in it before on important occasions. Stripped of everything except exactly what it meant. I understand that you're the most capable person I've spent time with in years, he said, and that somebody spent 4 years trying to convince you otherwise. And that watching you stop believing him has been... He stopped. Started again. It's been something I didn't expect to get to see, and I'm grateful every day that you were on that stagecoach. Rose stood up from the table. She walked around to his side, and he turned in his chair, and she took his face in both her hands, the way she'd done in the kitchen that first morning, and she looked at him for a long moment. This man, this specific person, this life. And then she said, I love you, Daniel Holt. She had not said it before. She'd felt it for weeks, had known it explicitly for more than a month, but saying it was a different act than knowing it. Saying it was making it real in a way that could be heard and held and responded to. And she had been afraid of that. And she was not afraid of it now. He reached up and covered her hands with his, the same gesture as before, the same careful and encompassing warmth. I love you, Rose, he said. I've loved you since you walked into that courthouse and spoke the truth out loud, even though your hands were shaking. My hands were shaking, she confirmed. Your voice wasn't. No, she said, it wasn't. He stood up, and she was very close to him, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her across the table, open, without management, entirely present. And she thought, I am not afraid. I am standing in my own kitchen, in my own house, with my own curtains on the windows, and my own books on the shelf, and the man I love looking at me like I am the thing that makes the room make sense. And I am not afraid. He kissed her, long and certain, and without any of the tentativeness of the first kiss in November. This was a different kiss, a kiss that knew where it was and intended to stay there. And she kissed him back with everything she had and had been keeping carefully, and was done keeping. Spring came to the Kansas plain the way it always came, sudden and absolute, as if it had been waiting just outside the door for the right moment. The grass went green overnight. The creek that had been locked under ice since December broke free and ran loud and fast through the cottonwoods. The sky, which had been low and gray for months, lifted and opened into something so blue and endless it looked like a different sky entirely. Rose stood in the garden behind the house with her hands in the new soil, the cold of it still in the ground, but the sun warm on the back of her neck. And she turned the earth over with the small spade and thought about what she was going to plant. Tomatoes along the south wall where the light was best, beans and squash in the middle rows, herbs along the near edge where she could reach them easily from the kitchen door. And in the far corner, not practical, just for the sake of it, flowers, whatever the seed catalog had that bloomed in August, something with color. She had earned flowers in a garden. She was allowed to want flowers. Daniel came around the corner of the house with 2 cups of coffee and stood at the edge of the turned earth and handed one down to her, and she sat back on her heels and took it, and they looked at the garden together. I think we should expand it this year, she said. The south side. There's room. Whatever you want, he said. I want a lot of things, she said. She looked up at him, this man who had given her back the ability to want things, who had been the patient and steady evidence that wanting things was allowed, and that good things were real. I want this garden, and those books, and this house, and you. I want the whole life, Daniel. I want all of it." He crouched down beside her in the dirt, his coffee in one hand, and looked at the turned earth, and then looked at her. "Then that's what we're building," he said. She pressed her free hand into the soil, cold and dark and full of everything that hadn't happened yet. And she thought about a woman on a stagecoach, with a bruise on her wrist, and a key in her pocket, and 2,000 miles between herself and the man who had told her she was nothing without him. She thought about everything that had grown in the months since then, quietly and persistently and without apology. The way things grow when they're finally given the right conditions. She thought about locked doors and open kitchens, and the specific weight of an account book that was hers to manage, and a library shelf full of books she'd chosen herself, and a man who thought her opinion about the cattle rotation was worth waiting for. She thought, Harlan Voss told me I was nothing. He was wrong about everything, but he was most wrong about that. She straightened up and stood on her own ground in the spring morning light, and she was not afraid, and she was not small, and she was not waiting for permission. She was Rose Calloway Holt, 24 years old, with dirt on her hands and coffee going warm, and a whole life laid out in front of her like good land that intended to give back everything she put into it. She had not merely survived what had been done to her. She had come out the other side of it, into something so genuinely and completely hers that the darkness behind her had no purchase on it whatsoever. She had run 2,000 miles from a man who said she was nothing, and she had arrived at this garden, this house, this morning, this man, and discovered that she was, in fact, everything. That was not an ending. That was the beginning of the only story that had ever really mattered. The one where Rose Calloway decided she was worth saving, and turned out to be right.